Welcome everybody to today's seminar. And before I go into anything, first of all, land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge that the majority of us here today are located on the Vancouver area and therefore are gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Shuar-Latu people. So it's always good to recognize this, and we thank our indigenous people for giving us the opportunity to share this place, wonderful place with them. Now, on the process for the seminar, please, first, please be aware that while we usually record this, okay, now we got the permission, so we are going to record it. This is all information. Jessica has just told us that we can record it, so it will be recorded as usual. Yeah. So that's nice. Thank you, Jessica, for allowing us to do this. Most importantly, if you have a question for our speaker, please enter it in the chat box located on the bottom bar on the Zoom screen towards the middle. Once we get to Q&A, the Q&A portion, those who are, once we get to that portion, those are the questions that our facilitators will actually look through and help us to ask. Today it is Colette Wabnes. Dr. Wabnes will be helping us do this, and this will be after Dr. Jessica Sparks has finished her talk. So the introduction of our speaker today, Dr. Jessica Sparks is an associate director at the University of Nottingham rice lab. It's a rice lab. I'm struggling with that, but the right to do something, the right to land, the right to food, right? So it's ecosystems and the environment program. She's also an assistant professor of anti-slavery ecosystems in the School of Geography, and also a Nottingham research fellow. So Jessica is right in there, the very hot spot between how human slavery actually fuels environmental degradation, in this case, oceans and fisheries, and how that links also to climate change. So you have all these things. We're really in the intersectionality zone of the world these days. You have everything coming together, whether it's the pandemic, is treating fellow human beings badly or whatever, gender issues all coming together. And I think you are right in that space. And it's beautiful to have this talk today. So, yeah, so I mentioned the pandemic. Yeah, before you started before the pre-COVID period, you also you were an expert advisor on modern slavery and fisheries for the Vatican, huh? So you probably talked to the Pope, who cares about many other things, not just the Catholic being a Pope, right? He cares about the environment and the people of the world and our well-being. So that is good to know that. At the end of the seminar, I'll come back to thank you, or Colette will do it. But here, I'll get off and give you the space, Jessica. Thank you for doing this for us.
Thank you for the invite. And I just wanted to say that I'm delighted to be here with you all virtually, at least today. And while normally I would be speaking to you from the United Kingdom, due to COVID-19, I'm currently in Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States, and thus want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Massachusetts people whose land and name were appropriated. So diving in, as Dr. Sumaya said, today I'm going to talk a little bit about our research about modern slavery at sea. First, a brief introduction to the University of Nottingham Rights Lab. That is Nottingham, as in the Sherwood Forest and the Robin Hood movies, if you've ever seen them. The exact same Nottingham. There's even a castle and a big Robin Hood statue. It's the thing the city's most proud of. But talking about the Rights Lab, it is the world's largest anti-slavery research group in the world. We currently do not fit within a specific school or discipline. Instead, we're transdisciplinary and we pull faculty from every school on campus. We're also very problem-oriented research group. And so our focus is on developing a blueprint to help end modern slavery by 2030, which is in line with Sustainable Development Goal 8.7. that end, we work with a number of international and domestic partners, ranging from UN bodies, governments, businesses, frontline NGOs, and even faith-based groups who are active in the anti-slavery movement. We also are connected to the Survivor Alliance, which is an NGO that aims to empower survivors to be active in the movement at all levels. So we aim to ensure that everything we do, from research design for our studies to our ethics protocols, etc., every step of the way we include survivor input. With that in mind, I also wanted to acknowledge that the imagery and the artwork on this slide was actually art produced by survivors, and there was actually a series of murals produced all across the world by survivors of modern slavery, human trafficking, etc. And to that end, we aim to not use what many survivors deem as exploitive imagery in our presentations and in our work, and instead we try to center those individuals' work. In the Rights Lab, we have 5 core programs. They're all cross-cutting and we often interact with each other, but we're all also guided by a core question. So to start, we have our data and measurement program, they're trying to determine how many people are in the world are subjected to modern slavery and where are they located. So we use a variety of tools, from novel strategies for prevalence estimates, including multiple systems estimation, which is actually derivative of capture recapture stemming from ecology, using remote sensing, geospatial tools, etc. Our communities and society program is almost the exact opposite. They're very ground-based, using a lot of participatory community-based research methods, and they're guided by a question of why does modern slavery persist and what creates resilience against it. We then move on to our business and economies program, and they really are focused on the impacts of modern slavery on the economy and how businesses can tackle modern slavery and their supply chain. Law and policy is all about closing the implementation gap between principle and practice. And my colleague, who's the associate director of that program, would be upset with me if I didn't acknowledge the reason that this program exists is because you may have heard that is illegal everywhere in the world. And while it is outlawed everywhere in the world, it's actually only criminalized in approximately 53% of countries. So we see a big gap between policy and practice. And last but not least is the program that I lead, which is ecosystems and the environment. And we're guided by a question of how is environmental change interconnected with modern slavery? So in this program, we primarily use a social ecological systems approach to look at the interconnections between environmental change, climate change, and environmental degradation. We use a variety of methods, mixed methods, quantitative, qualitative, and we actually work across sectors. So my background has been in fishing, and I've worked in fishing for about the past 6 years, but we also have research projects that are ongoing in forestry, in mining, agriculture, and brick making as well. And the reason why I bring that up is because it's actually been very interesting recently. A lot of our work has been using qualitative narratives, interviewing survivors, workers, etc. And we've actually heard, we call them their journey stories of how individuals end up being subjected to conditions of modern slavery in their employment activities. And what we've been hearing more and more of is actually interconnections between sectors. So individuals may have been subjected to modern slavery in fishing or trafficked into fishing, and then they actually get trafficked into forestry or mining or vice versa. And these interconnections between sectors are starting to pop up around the world, which is also sort of a new development in our research program, and will be interesting as we start to unpack those interconnections a bit more. So to begin, what is modern slavery? To set the stage, there is no generally agreed upon international legal definition for modern slavery. At the Rights Lab, we typically defer to the definition used by the Research Network on the legal parameters of slavery, which are more colloquially known as the Bellagio-Harvard guidelines. In those guidelines, modern slavery is defined as executing control over a person in such a way as to significantly deprive that person of their individual liberty with the intent of exploitation through the use, management, purchase, sale, profit, transfer, or disposal of that person. And this way, we typically use the term modern slavery as an umbrella term that encompasses egregious forms of labor exploitation that do not always constitute slavery, but that are codified in international law a bit more, such as forced labor, human trafficking, and servitude. So this is a controversial term. The reason why we use it is because in the United Kingdom, where we're based, it is consistent with national legislation, and that we have the United Kingdom Modern Slavery Act from 2015, and it is also being used at the international level. So as I mentioned, Sustainable Development Goal 8.7 is all about eliminating all forms of modern slavery. However, we also recognize that there are critiques of this term. There are some members of the Black community who feel that the term does co-opt experiences and the oppression derived from the transatlantic slave movement. In the United States, human trafficking is often the umbrella term, and there are also critiques of that term, and that human trafficking is often associated with a criminal justice prosecution lens, a lens that many survivors don't feel actually provides them with justice. So my strategy for this is to try and be as specific as we can in terms of what type of labor abuses we're actually talking about. So when we talk about modern slavery, actual slavery, we still see forms of actual slavery today. In terms of fishing, you might be aware of the case on Bendina Islands where fishers were locked in cages. That would be sort of the most egregious forms of exploitation that we see in the sector. We also, of course, see forced labor and trafficking, but there are also many forms of exploitation that we see in the sector that do not actually meet this egregious definition. They may or may not be violations of labor laws and regulations, depending on their severity, but we should still be recognizing them. So what does this look like in fishing? So we often talk about debt bondage in fishing. This is when fishers incur drastic amounts of debt in terms of transport. They may be asked to buy certain types of equipment, etc., before they even board the vessel. Sometimes they accrue this debt while on board. It could be for medications, it could be for food, lodging, etc. But ultimately, this debt is hyperinflated, and they have no knowledge of where the debt is even coming from. And they have to keep working until the debt is quote unquote paid off. So debt bondage, and this goes to show the complexity of these definitions, is that debt bondage is actually not covered under the ILO Convention on Forced Labor. It is considered a form of servitude, but sometimes its conditions often overlap with what would be classified legally as slavery. Hence, sort of the need for this umbrella term of modern slavery. But I also want to talk a little bit about the other end of the spectrum. So a common typology of labor exploitation that we see in fisheries is wage disparities. So in the United Kingdom, we particularly have this issue where we're seeing an influx of migrant workers, and they're basically paid pennies to the dollars of domestic fishers. Now, many people say that we're being extreme when we consider this as exploitation, or even start to consider it in the same breath as modern slavery. But it's important that we focus on these quote unquote, or that we don't ignore these quote unquote less severe forms or less severe typologies of labor exploitation. Because when we ignore them, we basically accept that less bad is doing good. And that's not where we want to be. And I'll circle back to this idea of then what is good towards the end of the presentation. So who are these fishers that end up in labor exploitation and modern slavery? We know that they are most frequently migrant fishers. These may be transnational migrants. They're most often transnational migrants, but we also see domestic fishers from certain, or domestic workers from certain countries end up being subjected to modern slavery or in conditions of forced labor or trafficked into the fishing sector. They're often very low wage workers. They come from lower income countries, but these activities may occur anywhere in the world. Also, at this point, we'd like to recognize that as a field, we need to do a much better job of making sure that these fishers are at the table. The Survivor Alliance that I mentioned before that we work with, they often use the slogan of nothing about us without us. And I think that's always a pertinent reminder, particularly when we start diving into the realm of interdisciplinary work or transdisciplinary work, and we already bring so many stakeholders to the table. We must be cognizant that we do not exclude these workers and these fishers from the table. I think I've already touched on this, but a good reminder about why this is the case is that many fishers that we've interviewed over the years, quite honestly, do not want prosecution. It is not justice to them. So a lot of times we jump to solutions without including the voices of workers. And quite frankly, they don't want prosecution because it's untenable for them to stay in the country while awaiting prosecution. There's immigration law issues. It's that they're not working, they don't have any finances, etc. And so many fishers also just want to keep fishing because they have a fear of being blacklisted, even when they're subjected to egregious violations of their labor rights. It's not for us to say should they leave that activity or not. That's really up to them. And we have to recognize that many fishers want to stay in these working conditions because they are coming from such desperation and extreme conditions on their own that they're willing to accept substandard working conditions. So we often think of our responsibility as making sure or ensuring that there are standard and normalized working conditions across fishing vessels. So where does labor exploitation and modern slavery in fishing occur? You might think that this is a Southeast Asia problem because this is where a lot of the media attention has focused on, and the limited amount of scholarly research that has been done has also focused on this area. Or you might think about Western Africa, particularly the Gulf of Guinea. It's been another hot spot where we often talk about modern slavery and fishing occurring. The reality is that it's happening almost everywhere. So the countries in red, over the past 6 years, we've been doing, as I mentioned, interviews with fishers all across the globe. And what we have found is that there is modern slavery and or labor exploitation in most countries' fisheries. This may include vessels that are flat to them or actually in their EEZ. So of the countries indicated, this is about 2/3 of the world's countries with coastlines. The Pacific Islands are not captured in this map because of scale issues, but we know that there are also cases of modern slavery and labor exploitation in those fisheries as well. And just a reminder is that the gray color doesn't absolve any country from this. It just means that in the interviews that we've conducted thus far, we haven't come across any implications for these countries. But in reality, if you start looking hard enough, you're likely going to find at least low-level labor exploitation, if not full-blown typologies of modern slavery. So about 5 years ago, when I started my PhD research, everyone kept telling me to look at the Scandinavian fisheries as sort of a negative case analysis about where we might actually see some quote-unquote clean fisheries. When I got to interviewing folks in Scandinavia, I started in Sweden, and a lot of people expressed hesitation that the fisheries there were clean, but they didn't necessarily have sort of indelible narratives from fishers or specific cases. And then, of course, last month, we know back in August, there was an arrest for human trafficking in the Danish fisheries for the subjecting 2 fishers from Ghana to conditions of modern slavery and human trafficking. Another example is just last week, we've been talking to the government and some government representatives from a specific high income country that I'm not allowed to disclose at the moment. We've been talking to them for about 3 months now, and they've been really, and I'm working with a colleague from the business school, so we're doing more of a supply chain analysis of some of their bigger fisheries. And they were always adamant that there are no cases of exploitation, there's no indicators of risk, etc. And over the past couple of months, as they've gotten more comfortable with us, and as they've recognized that those quote unquote less severe forms of exploitation are still in violation of labor laws, we did get them to admit last week that in reality, there are issues. There are issues in a very specific port, in a very specific type of fishery, etc. And so, again, just a reminder that Gray is not absolving any party involved in this. It's just that we don't have any interviews from Fisheries there yet. My own research recently has shifted to really focusing on high income countries, and that's because sitting in the United Kingdom, we've had multiple arrests under the Modern Slavery Act in the fishing sector, and it feels like a very privileged dance to be a white woman of European descent sitting in, an institution such as a university and pointing the finger to other countries or lower income countries when we absolutely have these same issues in our waters around the United Kingdom. Another thing that I want to note when looking at this map is often when we think about this issue, we tend to emphasize this issue occurring on long haul vessels or in distant water fleets. But in our narratives that we've been collecting, while the majority of abuses and exploitation in cases of modern slavery have occurred on long haul vessels, there are many narratives about fishers being exploited on vessels in EEZs, in territorial waters, and on short haul vessels. So it's not that those areas are immune from this problem at all. So as Dr. Sumaya noted, my research really focuses on the relationship between environmental degradation and modern slavery labor exploitation. So in the beginning, this is of course a very difficult topic to research. This analysis, and I apologize, my main computer is actually still in the United Kingdom as I'm stuck here in the US due to COVID. And so I'm having to improvise with graphics that I have that are much better on my main computer. But what this graphic details is sort of what we consider the primary relationship between these two things. So we know that overfishing, as overfishing increases, stocks decrease, catch per unit effort goes down, and effort increases. And that's all those pathways are actually pretty well supported by empirical data. We know that, of course, as effort increases, that puts a bigger constraint on profit margins. This is where it gets really difficult to research. So individuals who are subjected to forms of modern slavery are some of the most hidden individuals on the face of this earth. They are meant to be hidden. It's what allows modern slavery to persist. And then, of course, in fishing, this is compounded by the fact that they're not even on land, they're out at sea. So the rest of this diagram, we initially sort of built out using theoretical literature. So when profit margins decrease, we know that there's an increase in the demand for cheap labor. Why is that? There's actually really good theory in the anti-slavery and in the labor space about sectors that have very few input costs. So we know in fishing that fuel and labor comprise the majority of costs. I've seen estimates anywhere from 60 to 80%. So when profits start being constrained, they sort of have two options in order to cut back on costs. And fuel is a lot less out of their control. And so they resort to labor and they start looking for cheaper forms of labor, which often end up being migrant laborers. We see this across, so boat captains have flat out told us that it is cheaper to acquire and use cheap labor than to upgrade to new technologies. And as I mentioned, this is not uncommon. We see this in forestry and mining as well. So again, these sectors are very similar in that they rely on low wage, high manual labor, laborious work. And so then once you introduce the idea of cheap labor, that increases labor exploitation. Their profits start increasing. There's almost like a reward there, and then it perpetuates the cycle. So it's not only that overfishing helps increase or perpetuate the use of labor exploitation in modern slavery, but also then that modern slavery and labor exploitation help perpetuate overfishing. We know that there is a co-occurrence between labor abuses, modern slavery, and illegal IUU fishing in some parts of the world. And so this is very much a unidirectional relationship. Though this is my own work, and the 2019 date is a bit of a misnomer because this is one of those that died a slow, painful death at a journal. So this work was actually initially done 4 years ago. And I would tell you today that this is actually way too much of a simplification. Even in the original figure, the sort of gray amorphous area, we talked a lot about contextual factors, but we didn't really dive into them that much. Today, I would tell you that those contextual factors, they're enabling factors, and they're super important because they help us understand why using migrant labor leads to exploitation, and I think they're often overlooked. And just a quick note to say that one of the key tenets of modern slavery is that this idea of when you have labor exploitation and you earn a profit off of it, that's one of the core tenets. So I talked about those enabling factors, but taking a step back, that initial diagram talks a lot about the pull factors or the demand that comes from this sector. But we also need to acknowledge that there are lots of what we call push factors. These are factors that push individual workers into conditions of modern slavery. And so we call this quote unquote sort of the supply. So poverty is primarily considered the #1 primary driver of being subjected to modern slavery. Poverty is one of those factors that just exacerbates cumulative inequities. So that's everything from education. If you are more impoverished, you have more income volatility. You may not be as resilient to livelihood shocks. You might be one of the first to lose access to natural resources, food, and you may not be getting the same information and technologies to reduce all different types of risks. We also know that access to fishing rights in some communities can be a push factor. So these push factors basically force individuals to migrate, to accept opaque job offers, or to accept job offers with substandard working conditions. On the other side, that initial diagram talked about the pull factors or the demand for cheap labor that comes from the sector. I already talked on the role of decreased profits, but in our narratives, our individuals have recognized all different types of constructs that have largely been excluded from this conversation to date. So in high income countries, that might be labor scarcity. We also have labor precarity, how the fisheries and oceans are managed, the role of fishing in the community and its cultural ties, to everything to like shell companies, subsidies, I can't talk today, IUU fishing, and sector consolidation. I also want to note that these push, pull, and contextual factors, they're linked to one another across the different categories, but they're also really linked to each other. And quite honestly, I don't think we have a good grasp on sort of the sequence of all of these factors. And so when I say they're also linked to each other, in the United Kingdom, in our fisheries, we see this issue where the fisheries management regime has led to sector consolidation, which has had a knock-on effect about labor scarcity, lack of domestic workers, and then that has seen a big increase in the use of migrant workers in the sector. Then you hop over to these contextual factors, and they're really sort of what enabled this relationship, this knock-on relationship between the environment and modern slavery to persist. We have to talk about immigration and migration laws. Again, these individuals are migrant workers. We also know that many governments actually use the risk of modern slavery, human trafficking, and labor exploitation as a reason to justify really restrictive or conservative immigration and migration laws, and that many individuals who are subjected to these conditions are undocumented migrants. And so, and many countries, even like the United Kingdom, which has excellent, labor laws, the Modern Slavery Act, where we've already ratified ILO 188 and it's enforced. It's enforced in our country. The hostile environment immigration law has essentially completely undermined those initiatives. We know that individuals are much more likely to be treated as undocumented migrants before they're likely to be treated as survivors or victims of modern slavery, labor exploitation, etc. Similarly, we also have to note about racism, xenophobia, and discrimination. The reason why boat captains are willing to exploit migrant workers is because they actually think it's justifiable. Again, in conversations with boat captains, we've heard everything from, well, we're still paying them more money to what they would be making in their home country, to much more racist and xenophobic language that would not be appropriate for me to repeat today. These other contextual factors that enable these relationships are regulatory context, so not only just immigration and migration law, environmental governance, corruption, etc. The geography, of course, is really important. As I've already mentioned, these vessels are often far out at sea. There's always the excuse of supply chain complexity, which a lot of people use as an excuse for why this problem is so hard to tackle. But in reality, supply chain complexity doesn't have to be an enabler. It can be an inhibitor. We can come up with supply chain solutions that help mitigate this really harmful relationship. And the most important thing is power imbalances. We cannot ignore all these different constructs and their importance to the relationship by just focusing on that primary relationship, because we will ignore the power imbalances. To really solve this problem, we have to figure out a way to disrupt the power imbalances at all different levels. So that would be, power imbalances on vessels, to power imbalances in society and supply chains. It is really pertinent and something that allows modern slavery and all of its typologies to persist across the world. So all of these narratives that I've talked about, basically we code them qualitatively. Also during the interviews, we actually have participants map out the system, what that system looks like. What are the chain of events that led to their working conditions? What is their understanding of some of the influences? And because we have them quantify the strength, the qualitatively tell us the direction of the relationship and quantify the strength of the relationship. Basically, we can then convert that into an adjacency matrix, and we can do some hypothetical case scenario modeling. So what this graph is actually showing is what we've taken all those interviews, and now that we've modeled them into scenarios, it shows the predicted deviation and the use of exploitation and modern slavery when central variables or variables that statistically have the most influence in the system are manipulated. So the bar changes are changes in modern slavery based on that factor increasing or decreasing. So what this shows, for example, is that if stock declines continue to decrease, or continue to increase and get worse, and stocks continue to decline, we see that that actually has a pretty significant effect on modern slavery increasing and persisting in the sector. But interesting enough, if we can stop the declines and reverse them, that has little effect on causing modern slavery in the sector to decrease. Very similar trend with fishing effort and subsidies, interestingly enough, for them being so pertinent in the system statistically, when we manipulate them, they don't seem to have much influence on modern slavery. IUU fishing seems like a toss-up. I think that's really because we don't have a good grasp still on the relationship. It's a little bit of what comes first, the chicken or the egg. Is it that IUU fishing causes more modern slavery or vice versa, etc.? I think that is a really complex problem that we're still very much trying to untangle. And then, of course, labor and migration regulations, they don't do much. You know, if they get worse, it doesn't seem to have much of an impact on modern slavery. That's probably because most people perceive those regulations as already being pretty bad and often being in direct conflict of each other. But if we can improve them, harmonize them, you see a tremendous difference in preventing. So the overall takeaway from this, I think, is that prevention is really, really important. Responses to some of these key central variables may not work on vessels that are already using modern slavery. There's likely little incentive for them to stop using it once they start using it. And this is also not necessarily that different from other sectors as well. So to wrap up in my last few minutes, some important things to consider moving forward. How is the marine environment changing? So we tend to focus a lot on fish stock declines, but what about if climate change and warming waters start causing stocks to shift quite a bit? We've seen this in some parts of the world already, where essentially, I'll use the example of Russia. Russia's vessels have shifted where they're fishing a bit into some of Northern Europe's waters. And quite frankly, those governments have been ill prepared to deal with the complexity of that relationship and that actor in of itself. And so will we see sort of new hotspots emerging? We think of these traditional hotspots of Southeast Asia and Western Africa, but are we going to have also new hotspots in places that we may not have expected it? So I would still argue that these working conditions are on vessels all around the world due to shifting stocks. I think we're still really trying to understand what is a true transdisciplinary partnership or approach. Of course, when you're trying to combine environmental data and more social data, you've got differences in epistemology and ontology and what constitutes data. And I've had lots of people ask me if doing interviews and collecting those qualitative narratives, if that's really data or not. And so I think if we're really going to come together across disciplines to tackle this problem, we need a really good blueprint of what that transdisciplinary partnership and approach looks like. Also, binary approaches to classifying exploitation. We often say, yes, this is modern slavery, yes, this is labor exploitation, or no, it's not. Again, why that's harmful is also when we are primarily asking fishers about their experiences, unlike what we would call transatlantic slavery, modern slavery is very fluid. So individuals can actually be in conditions of modern slavery in one moment, and they may not be in the next moment, and then it could change again the next day. So they're very fluid, and that makes those binary approaches a bit more difficult. Related to that is, what is decent work? So in theory, if we achieve Sustainable Development Goal 8.7, the elimination of all forms of modern slavery, on terms of the labor side, that means that we should be achieving decent work. ILO Convention 188 sets out to try and establish some basic norms around decent work, but in reality, that instrument has been uptaken by very few countries, and we tend to define decent work by the absence of its antithesis, that extreme form of exploitation, the modern slavery, the forced labor, the human trafficking. So when we define decent work by its antithesis, the absence of that extreme form, what we lose is all those mid-level forms of exploitation. So, you know, disparities in wage payments, etc. Why I think that's really important to capture those quote unquote sort of mid-level ranges and forms of exploitation is because I'm very interested in the idea of what are tipping points. So are there certain measures that actors or vessels start taking that signal a red flag that this vessel or this employer is, venturing into precarious territory where they might start exploiting their workers further? Is safety, violating safety measures, safety equipment, is the one that always comes to my mind. And we're hopefully getting some funding to study that a bit more. But to this date, we haven't really delved into that. Taking a step back to the decent work, I mentioned ILO 188. I think one of the biggest challenges around 188, even when it's implemented, is trying to educate fishers, even non-exploited fishers, on their rights, on their labor rights, and also on these norms of what work should look like. So right before COVID kicked off, we were doing some baseline work that was to inform a much broader systematic study of UK fisheries. And this would have also been 11 months after the UK ratified 188 and 1 month prior to it coming into force. We didn't find a single fisher that we spoke to who actually knew what their labor rights were under 188 or under domestic legislation. I think this is going to be a huge hurdle for the field, is education on norms and rights. Going back forward to my idea of tipping points, what is the role of time and temporality? And in terms of the anti-slavery community, we're just really sort of crap at this in general because it's so difficult to get data on this phenomenon. We're not the best at constructing longitudinal data sets. And as a result, we don't really understand sort of the role of time. So if fish stock declines are a driver, when in that decline do we start to see these shifts in the labor practices? I already touched on the co-opting of migration risk by governments to further enact very restrictive immigration legislation. So I think that's a point that we have to be really mindful of moving forward in terms of how we frame these issues, because we have had examples where our research was basically used to enact some negative changes that we would have never, ever advocated for. And then if we're talking about linked environmental labor issues, so how do we develop policy action? Should it be coupled and then that in that there's a policy that is holistic and multi-sectoral that aims to address issues in both the environmental side of fisheries and the labor? Or should we be looking for something that's more, or be designing something that's more synergistic and that it's still siloed by sector and discipline, but you're anticipating unintended consequences? The example that I usually give for this is that, if we end transshipment, we know that for people using transshipment legally, that transshipment saves a lot of fuel costs. So if we end transshipment, does that constrain profits so extremely because of the increase in fuel costs and other operating costs that we then see an increase in exploitive labor, the use of cheap labor that leads to exploitation, etc. So if we're going to enact that policy, can we develop a synergistic policy to balance potentially some of those unintended consequences or feedback, which is also, I think, a great example of why the systems, the social ecological systems approach is really beneficial in this space, so that we can try and predict or anticipate what some of those unintended consequences are. So I almost had a perfect 2 minutes shy of quarter till. So I will stop here. I will give a brief message to say that I'm always happy to chat with anybody about these issues. So please just always feel free to reach out to me or to others in our community at the Research Lab, at the Rights Lab. We have over 150 people affiliated with us. So even if I don't have an answer to your question, I suspect one of my brilliant colleagues will. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was fantastic and fantastic timing as well. Um, and yes, thank you so much for your very timely and thought-provoking presentation. I particularly like the link at the end personally that you made to policy and thinking about how one decision in one well may impact another, which I think is really important. So moving to the question period. So Andres Cisneros has a question for you. So I will turn the mic to him to ask you that question.
Oh shoot, I thought you were gonna ask it. Should have combed my hair. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm good, I'm good. Thank you so much for the shoe recommendation. My wife
Oh,
loved the
yes.
present. Remember the Rothy's?
Yes.
Total win. It's crazy to think of the before times when you actually could chit chat in the
Yeah,
coffee
in
breaks.
person.
This was awesome. Great presentation, and I actually especially loved your framing for the enabling factors. Because first, I saw that kind of linear thing. I was like, no, and then you like immediately went in, and so that was great. And so there was one part, and actually, Colette, I can't see everyone's question, so I'll just ask one because I had two, but I'll just the first one to give everyone a chance.
Yeah, just
so
go
I
for
might
the
have
first one.
misunderstood. Yeah, I might have misunderstood, but so did you say that people indicated that fish stock declines contributed to modern slavery, but then if the declines were reversed, it wouldn't help, right? So why is that, right? Because that's really concerning if we're like arguing for, recovering ecosystems. Yeah.
Yeah, so that came in the modeling. So we take the qualitative narratives and then we come up with the adjacency metrics and then we do some scenario modeling. I suspect that's because once someone has essentially fallen off the cliff and do those practices, it's just, there's no incentive for them to come back. So even though that's a driver that could push them there, that there's nothing to honestly bring them back. And I think that's because this type of labor exploitation, there's not a lot, it's a very low risk activity. So fishing, forestry, some agriculture, it happens in spaces where there's just not a lot of oversight. And fishing, what's already a low risk activity, becomes even less riskier, because even with satellites that can monitor vessel behavior, they're still not actually seeing what's on the vessel. And so that is my best hypothesis about why, based on the systems that people build, that we don't see the same, why it can drive it, but we don't see it being able to help curb it.
Right. So once you already started doing it, you might as well. Okay.
Yeah, and that goes back to those enabling factors about racism, discrimination, et cetera, as well.
Thanks so much, Jessica.
Yeah. I also saw your quick question about authorities. I think you said, where are the authorities? I just saw that.
Yeah,
pop up on the chat.
you kind of answered it. Yeah, I mean, for sure.
Yeah.
Right?
And one thing that I should have pointed out is that a lot of people talk about labor inspections. Increasing labor inspections is, in theory, on paper, a great idea, but we know that labor inspections and immigration get conflated a lot, but also that labor inspections and fisheries are really hard. ILO has talked about this extensively with labor inspectors in Thailand in particular, and that when you have different vessels coming in with different flag states, it's hard to, it's just quite hard for inspectors to know the regulations and standards for every country that essentially they're having to abide by. And so we know that's a big challenge with labor inspections in particular.
I'll jump in and ask a quick question, Jessica. I was wondering whether, I mean, given, the reality of the world right now under COVID, I was wondering, granted you can't, go talk to fishers in the same way, but what's some of the patterns that you have seen emerging based on the research that you've been able to do so far?
So we've mostly been focused on seafarers at the moment because of the seafarer crew crisis, where it's estimated, up to 400,000 seafarers are now working beyond and without contract, and that technically constitutes conditions of forced labor. So we've primarily been focused on that. I think it varies by country. So as I mentioned, I'm primarily focused on the United Kingdom, and we have a unique law that says that migrants cannot be in our 12-mile territorial waters. They can't. So migrants can be on land if they have an appropriate visa, or they can be beyond the 12 miles. But we also have a very exploitive visa scheme in the country that operators have found a loophole to exploit that basically allows fishers to come into the country on a 72-hour visa. They have to board the vessel and go out to sea. So we do fear that we have fishers that are basically trapped in really bad conditions because they can't come on land. They'd be in violation of immigration law. And in theory, they shouldn't be in harbor or port because that's a violation of immigration law as well. They would have to be out at sea within a certain time frame. So most of my energy has been focused there at the moment. So that's about all that I can say about that right now.
Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, no, immigration, I can see how immigration would definitely make things tricky. So Nigel Hagan has a question as well. I'm not sure if he's able to speak just now, but he wrote the question out, so I'll read it out for him. So the question is, you touch on a tension between law and justice in the case of fishers not wanting to prosecute. Camry Clark talks about how prosecution of high-level cases, example, Joseph Kony, child soldiers, distract from the broader justice issues that give rise to these crimes. So I'll leave it at that because that's all I have to go on, unless Nigel wants to step in and sort of clarify a little bit further. Okay, maybe not. So either, I mean, I'll let you either go with what you have, or maybe you can answer the question offline, because we also have another question that Sarah Foster wants to ask. Do you want to do the latter or the former?
I'll just briefly say that I don't think it's for any scholar to define what justice is. I think we have to have fishers and workers at the table, and we also have to ensure that we don't come up with a blanket definition based on a couple that are at the table as well. To know that this is going to be varied across fishers, across workers, etc., and that this is complicated by a lot of those enabling factors, and it really depends on what country they're in when they interact with some type of frontline service provider that aims to either help them get their wages, improve their working conditions, get them out of the situation, etc.
Thank you, Jessica. Sarah, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure, thank you. So I'm just curious, your comment about how we need to consider how one policy might impact this problem made me think about how right now the World Trade Organization is negotiating a policy around subsidies, fishing subsidies, perverse fishing subsidies, but they're only looking at the strict definition of the term. So they're not including, for example, what I would consider a really important subsidy, which is a labor subsidy to fisheries. But it seems possible that should governments, for example, agree that they're going to end fuel subsidies under that negotiation, that could actually lead to an increase in forced labor to offset costs. And I don't know if you're the person to ask this to, but I'm just wondering, is that being dealt with in any formal way in that negotiation process? Because it seems a real potential challenge.
I'm not familiar enough with the negotiation process to know if it's being dealt with, but I agree. It's a potential challenge. And the problem is when we start talking about policy, it goes back to this idea of transdisciplinary research, and something I work with the UK government all the time. I meet with them regularly and trying to bring our all parliamentarian group on fisheries and on modern slavery together for some of the issues we're having in Scotland. One of the big challenges is what constitutes evidence and what are the thresholds for evidence even for policymakers. And so the Fisheries APPG is used to very quantitative, longitudinal data sets, which we just don't have in modern slavery. We can design some based on risk and proxies, but so how do we also harmonize these different thresholds of evidence for policymakers, which I think is a really big challenge. So just to say that that's just another consideration, but why I think there is the risk that we could have these unintended consequences, but I don't know if that's being considered in the current negotiations or not.
Thank you.